She knew she shouldn't have spent the money, but desperation makes people do beautiful, foolish things. Evelyn Rose Maris stood in front of her bathroom mirror at 6:47 a.m., applying nude lipstick with the precision of someone who had learned to armor herself with elegance. Her hands trembled slightly, not from the escitalopram she'd taken with her morning coffee, but from the weight of what today represented. The Rent the Runway box sat on her bed like a promise wrapped in tissue paper. $1,000. That was 2 months of her therapy sessions, 3 months of grocery shopping, or half of her emergency fund. But it was also her ticket to belonging, even if just for one night. She slipped into the wine-colored dress, feeling the silk against her skin like a whisper of confidence she desperately needed. Her reflection showed a woman who could belong in any boardroom, any gala, any world she chose. What it didn't show was the anxiety clawing at her chest, the way her breath caught when she thought about walking into that hotel ballroom. At 33, Evelyn had mastered the art of invisible elegance. Her auburn-highlighted hair fell in soft waves past her shoulders. Her gray-blue eyes held secrets she'd never shared, and her 5'7" frame moved with the grace of someone who had learned to take up just enough space. Never too much, never too little. The Uber Black arrived at 6:30 p.m. sharp. As Denver's skyline blurred past the window, she rehearsed small talk in her head. "How's the new project going?" "The weather's been beautiful. Did you see the quarterly results? Safe conversations, professional distance, the kind of interactions that had kept her employed and invisible for the past 4 years." Thorne and Zeiss Technologies' annual event was being held at the Grand Hyatt, and as Evelyn stepped into the marble lobby, she felt the familiar weight of being simultaneously overdressed and underprepared. The ballroom hummed with the energy of success. Crisp laughter, the clink of champagne glasses, conversations that sounded important even from a distance. She clutched her small clutch bag tighter, her phone buzzing with a text from her BetterHelp therapist. "Remember, you belong there as much as anyone else. You've earned your place." If only it felt that way. The crowd was a sea of networking smiles and strategic conversations. Evelyn moved through it like she was underwater, nodding politely when colleagues acknowledged her, accepting a glass of champagne she wouldn't drink, and scanning the room for a familiar face. Any familiar face. That's when she saw him. Standing with his back to her, talking to a small group near the floor-to-ceiling windows, was what she was certain was Matt from her UX team. Same height, same build, same confident posture. Matt, who sent funny gifs in their Slack channel and always remembered to ask how her weekend was. Matt, who represented the closest thing to a work friend she'd allowed herself to have. Relief flooded through her chest. Finally, someone who wouldn't look at her like she was an intruder at her own company's event. Without thinking, driven by a moment of pure human need for connection, Evelyn walked across the room. Her heels clicked softly against the marble floor, her heart beating with the anticipation of familiar comfort. She reached out and wrapped her arms around him from behind, a gesture so natural, so desperately needed, that she didn't hesitate. "Matt, I'm so glad you're here. I was starting to think I didn't know anyone." The man turned around, and Evelyn's world stopped. Dark brown eyes, sharp as winter mornings, stared down at her with an expression she couldn't read. This wasn't Matt's warm green gaze or easy smile. This was a face carved from shadows and discipline, framed by a perfectly trimmed beard, and topped with dark hair that probably cost more to maintain than her monthly rent. This was Elliot Reese Thorne, the CEO, the man who signed her paychecks, the billionaire who had never spoken to her directly in 4 years of employment, the man she had just embraced like an old friend. The ballroom seemed to pause, conversations quieting just enough for her mistake to echo in the space between them. She felt the weight of eyes turning toward them, phones being lifted, the gentle buzz of curiosity becoming something sharper. She started, but words failed her. Elliot's expression remained unreadable, but something shifted in his eyes. Not anger, not embarrassment, something else entirely. "You thought I was someone else," he said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made boardrooms silent. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Thorne. I thought you were. I know who you thought I was." The moment stretched between them like a bridge neither knew how to cross. Around them the party continued, but Evelyn felt like she was standing in a spotlight she had never asked for, and in that moment, she made a decision that would change everything. She didn't run. She didn't stammer through explanations. She simply looked at him with the same steady gaze she'd perfected in mirrors. nodded once and said, "Excuse me." Then she turned and walked away, leaving behind a man who had just experienced something he'd never felt before, the touch of someone who wanted absolutely nothing from him. What she didn't know was that Elliot Reese Thorne would spend the next 36 hours thinking about nothing else. The internet never forgets, but sometimes it remembers the wrong story. By 11:47 p.m. that same night, Evelyn was trending. She sat in her small Denver apartment, still wearing the wine-colored dress that had cost her a month of financial security, staring at her phone screen with the kind of detached fascination reserved for watching car accidents. The video had been posted by someone called a Tech Bro Sips with the caption, "When you mistake the CEO for your work crush, corporate, life, awkward, Thorne, and Zeiss." The footage was grainy but clear enough. There she was, approaching from behind, wrapping her arms around Elliot Thorne with the confidence of someone who belonged in his world. The moment of realization, his unreadable expression, her composed exit, it was all there, preserved in digital amber for the world to dissect. The comments were rolling in faster than she could read them. Girl really said, "Shoot your shot. That's not awkward, that's bold." Plot twist, she knew exactly who he was. The way she walked away, though, iconic. CEO looked like he didn't hate it. Evelyn set her phone face down on her coffee table and walked to her kitchen. Her apartment was a study in understated elegance. Cream walls, vintage furniture she'd found at estate sales, plants that somehow thrived despite her chaotic schedule. It was the kind of space that whispered rather than shouted, much like its owner. She made chamomile tea with hands that had stopped shaking, settling into her reading chair by the window that overlooked the city lights. This was her ritual, her way of processing the unprocessable. But tonight, even the familiar comfort felt foreign. Her phone buzzed, then buzzed again, and again. Instagram notifications, LinkedIn messages, text from her neighbor, "Girl, is this you on TikTok?" By 2 a.m., the hashtag, "Mistake or Destiny," was trending. The video had been shared across platforms, spawning reaction videos, think pieces about workplace boundaries, and an entire Reddit thread analyzing her body language. Someone had even identified her dress as a Rent the Runway rental, leading to comments about trying too hard and fake it till you make it energy. But instead of shame, Evelyn felt something unexpected, relief. For 4 years, she had moved through her professional life like a ghost, competent, reliable, invisible. She had perfected the art of being present without being seen, of contributing without being remembered. It was safer that way, quieter, less likely to trigger the anxiety that had once consumed her. Now she was visible, and the world hadn't ended. At 3:17 a.m., she made a decision that surprised even her. She opened Instagram, looked at her carefully curated feed of aesthetic coffee cups and motivational quotes, and deleted the app. Then LinkedIn, then TikTok. If they wanted to talk about her, they could do it without her participation. Meanwhile, 37 floors above the Denver skyline, Elliot Thorne stood in his penthouse office, still wearing his tailored suit from the event. The city sprawled below him like a circuit board, all lights and connections. But he felt more isolated than ever. He'd seen the video. His assistant had shown it to him with barely concealed amusement, expecting him to be annoyed or embarrassed. Instead, he'd watched it 7 times, studying the moment when she realized her mistake. There had been no calculation in her eyes, no recognition of opportunity, just pure, honest embarrassment followed by a dignity that most people twice her age couldn't muster. Elliot had built his empire on reading people, on understanding their motivations before they understood them themselves. Investors, competitors, employees, they all wanted something from him, and he'd learned to navigate those wants like a chess master 3 moves ahead. But Evelyn Rose Maris had wanted nothing from him. She had mistaken him for someone else entirely, someone ordinary enough to hug without ceremony. And when she realized her error, she hadn't tried to turn it into an advantage or a moment of connection. She had simply left. For a man who had spent 20 years being pursued, that kind of indifference was intoxicating. He pulled up her employee file on his computer, something he'd never done for any individual contributor in his company. UX/UI designer, hired 4 years ago, consistently high performance ratings, 0 disciplinary actions. She worked exclusively remote, rarely attended company events, and had never requested a single meeting with leadership. She was, by all accounts, exactly the kind of employee he never noticed. Until now, his phone buzzed with a text from his younger sister Mira. Saw the video, Please tell me you're not going to do something weird and CEO-ish about this. Elliot stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, "Define weird." Her response came immediately. "That's exactly what I was afraid of." But as he stood there, watching the city sleep while his mind raced, Elliot realized he was already planning something that would either be brilliant or catastrophically stupid. He was going to see her again. Not the polished, distant version of herself she presented at company events, but the real woman who had reached out for human connection in a room full of strangers. The woman who had touched him like he was just another person worth knowing. By morning, his plan was already in motion, and Evelyn had no idea her quiet life was about to become very complicated. Sometimes the most powerful moves in business are disguised as company policies. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning at 9:23 a.m., marked as high priority and sent to every remote employee at Thorn & Zeiss Technologies. Evelyn read it while sitting in her home office, wearing her favorite cream silk blouse and dark slacks, the kind of outfit that made her feel put together even when no one was watching. Subject: Enhancing Collaborative Excellence. New Hybrid Work Initiative. Dear Team, as we continue to build the future of technology, we recognize that innovation thrives on human connection. Effective immediately, all remote employees will transition to a hybrid schedule, working from our Denver headquarters 3 days per week. Evelyn's coffee mug paused halfway to her lips. She read the email twice, then a third time, searching for exceptions, for loopholes, for any indication that this wasn't exactly what it appeared to be. 4 years? 4 years of perfect work-from-home productivity, of meeting every deadline, of contributing to projects that had helped the company grow from a mid-sized startup to a tech giant. 4 years of carefully constructed distance from office politics, from the pressure to be on in person, from the exhausting performance of workplace socialization. Her phone rang. The caller ID showed Dax Morrison, her teammate, and the closest thing she had to a work friend. "Did you see the email?" Dax's voice carried the same bewilderment she felt. 3 days a week? What happened to remote work increases productivity by 40% and all that corporate speak they fed us during the pandemic? "I saw it," Evelyn said, walking to her window that overlooked a small park where she sometimes ate lunch while video calling with clients. A sanctuary that was about to become a memory. "My wife is going to kill me. We just bought a house in Littleton specifically because I could work from home. Now I'm looking at 3 hours of commuting every day." Dax paused. "Sorry, I know you live closer to downtown. This probably isn't as big a deal for you." If only he knew. "It's an adjustment," she said carefully. After they hung up, Evelyn sat in the silence of her apartment, feeling the walls of her carefully constructed world shifting around her. She had built this life deliberately, controlled, predictable, safe. Home was where she could be herself without performance, where her anxiety could exist without judgment, where she could work at her highest level without the drain of constant social navigation. But there was something else gnawing at her, something she didn't want to acknowledge. The timing of this policy change, coming just 5 days after the viral video, felt too convenient to be coincidental. She shook her head, dismissing the thought. She was a mid-level designer in a company of over 3,000 employees. The idea that a billionaire CEO would restructure remote work policies because of one awkward encounter was narcissistic at best, paranoid at worst, wasn't it? The next morning, Evelyn stood in front of her closet at 6:30 a.m., staring at clothes she hadn't worn in months. Office clothes, the armor of in-person professionalism. She selected a navy blazer, tailored pants and low heels. Sophisticated enough to command respect, comfortable enough to survive a full day of performance. The Thorn & Zeiss building was a gleaming testament to modern architecture, all glass and steel reaching toward the Colorado sky. As she walked through the lobby for the first time in over a year, Evelyn felt like she was entering a foreign country where she'd once been fluent, but had forgotten the customs. The elevator ride to the 15th floor felt eternal. She checked her reflection in the polished steel doors. Composed, professional, unremarkable. Exactly how she needed to appear. The UX team's floor had been redesigned since her last visit. Open concept workstations, collaboration spaces with whiteboard walls. A kitchen area with a coffee machine that probably cost more than her monthly rent. It was beautiful, modern, and everything she'd learned to avoid during her banking years. "Evelyn," Dax's voice cut through her observations. He approached with the kind of smile that meant he'd been talking about her. "Look who's back in civilization. Just trying to adapt to our new collaborative excellence," she said. matching his light tone while surveying the space. As the morning progressed, she settled into a workstation by the windows, grateful for the natural light and the view that reminded her of home. Her colleagues were friendly but not intrusive, welcoming but not overly curious about her return. The work itself was familiar, reviewing user interface mock-ups, collaborating on user experience flows, the kind of creative problem-solving that had drawn her to this field in the first place. It was almost 2 p.m. when she saw him. Elliot Thorne walked through the floor with the kind of purposeful stride that made conversations pause and heads turn. He was dressed in what she was beginning to recognize as his signature style, perfectly tailored dark suit, no tie, the kind of confident minimalism that only came with unlimited resources and unshakable self-assurance. Their eyes met across the open office space. For a moment that felt like an hour, neither looked away. His expression was unreadable, professional, but there was something in his gaze that made her pulse quicken, not with anxiety, but with recognition of something she couldn't name. He nodded once, a barely perceptible acknowledgement, and continued his path through the office. But Evelyn noticed something that made her stomach drop and her intuition flare to life. This was the first time in 4 years that the CEO had personally visited the UX floor. As she watched him disappear around the corner, engaging in brief conversations with team leads and senior designers, one thought echoed in her mind with crystalline clarity. This isn't about company culture or collaborative excellence. This is about me. And she had no idea whether that terrified her or thrilled her more. The most dangerous conversations happen in the safest places. Evelyn had developed a routine in her 3 weeks of hybrid work. Arrive at 8:15 a.m., settle at her preferred workstation by the windows, grab coffee from the premium machine at 10:30 when most people were deep in their morning workflow. It minimized small talk, maximized productivity, and kept her anxiety at manageable levels. What she hadn't planned for was finding Elliot Thorne standing by the coffee machine at exactly 10:30 on a Thursday morning, studying the buttons like they contained state secrets. She paused in the doorway of the kitchen area, watching him press different combinations with the focused intensity he probably brought to board meetings. His sleeves were rolled up to his forearms, a small detail that made him seem less untouchable, more human. "The left button twice, then the right one," she said quietly, stepping into the space. He turned, and she caught something unexpected in his expression. Relief, not the polished confidence she'd observed from a distance, but genuine appreciation for help with something as simple as coffee. "Thank you." His voice was quieter than she remembered from the event, less commanding. "I don't usually visit this floor." No kidding, she thought, but said instead, "The machine is temperamental. Took me 3 tries on my first day back." They stood side by side as the machine hummed to life, dispensing perfectly crafted coffee into his cup. The silence wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it was loaded with things neither of them was saying. "You've been settling back in well," he said, and she realized he'd been observing her return more closely than she'd thought. "It's an adjustment." She pressed her own button combination, hyper-aware of how close he was standing, of the subtle scent of his cologne mixed with something warmer, maybe cedar, maybe just the smell of expensive fabric. "I imagine it is. 4 years of remote work creates habits." There was something in the way he said it that made her look at him directly. His dark eyes were studying her face like he was trying to solve an equation, and she felt that familiar flutter of anxiety mixed with something else entirely. "Mr. Thorne," she said carefully, "can I ask you something?" "Elliot." "And yes. Did you implement the hybrid work policy because of what happened at the event?" The directness of her question seemed to surprise him. Most people, she imagined, spent conversations with him dancing around topics, never quite saying what they meant. But Evelyn had learned long ago that anxiety was worse than honesty, and she needed to know if her professional life had been upended because of a 30-second mistake. He was quiet for a long moment, and she watched something shift in his expression, a decision being made in real time. "Yes," he said simply. The honesty of it hit her like cold air. She'd expected deflection, corporate speak, plausible deniability. Instead, he'd given her the truth with the same directness she'd offered him. "Why?" The question came out softer than she intended. "Because..." He paused, and for the first time since she'd known of his existence, Elliot Thorne looked uncertain. "Because I've spent 20 years being approached by people who want something from me. Money, connections, opportunities, validation. And you touch me like I was just someone worth knowing." The coffee machine beeped, signaling her drink was ready, but neither of them moved. I didn't know who you were, she said quietly. I know. That's exactly the point. They stood there in the small kitchen space, surrounded by the distant sounds of office life, while something fundamental shifted between them. Evelyn felt like she was standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down at water she couldn't see the bottom of. This isn't appropriate, she said. But even as she said it, she wasn't sure if she was talking to him or herself. No, he agreed. It's not. I could file a complaint. Changing company policy to manipulate an employee's work situation. You could. His eyes never left hers. Will you? The question hung between them like a challenge, and an invitation rolled into one. Evelyn realized that somewhere in the space between his confession and this moment, the power dynamic had shifted. He'd given her ammunition that could destroy his reputation, his career, everything he'd built, and they both knew she wouldn't use it. No, she said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. But I need you to understand something. What's that? I'm not a project to be solved or a challenge to be conquered. I'm not broken. I'm not waiting to be rescued. And I'm not interested in being anyone's entertainment. Something that might have been admiration flickered across his features. What are you interested in? She picked up her coffee, using the movement to buy herself a moment to think. When she looked at him again, she'd made a decision that surprised even her. I don't know yet. But if you want to find out, you'll have to do better than corporate manipulation. With that, she walked out of the kitchen, leaving him standing by the coffee machine with an expression she'd never seen on his face before. The look of a man who'd just been outmaneuvered by someone he'd underestimated. What she didn't know was that Elliot Thorne had never been more intrigued by a challenge in his entire life. Some dances are performed without music, without touching, without anyone else even knowing they're happening. The book appeared on Evelyn's desk on a Tuesday morning like a question mark made of paper and ink. The Architecture of Happiness by Alain de Botton. A slim volume about how our surroundings shape our inner lives. No note, no explanation. Just the book positioned precisely next to her monitor where she couldn't miss it. She opened the cover carefully, half expecting some kind of message, but found only clean pages and the faint scent of new paper. When she looked up, scanning the open office space, she caught a glimpse of Elliot's silhouette in the glass-walled conference room 3 floors above, visible through the building's atrium design. He wasn't looking down at her floor, but somehow she knew he was aware she'd found it. This was how it had been for 2 weeks since their coffee machine conversation, a careful choreography of almost encounters and meaningful distances. He would take the same elevator she rode but get off 1 floor early. She would find her favorite lunch spot in the building's cafe suddenly stocked with the specific brand of tea she preferred. He would schedule walking meetings that happened to pass by the windows of her floor exactly when she took her afternoon break. Never direct, never obvious, never crossing the line he'd drawn with his confession, and she'd redrawn with her challenge, but always present. Evelyn found herself caught in the strangest situation of her adult life, being pursued by someone who wasn't actually pursuing her, who was instead creating a space around her that felt like possibility without pressure. Someone's got a secret admirer, teased Jenna, the junior designer who sat at the station next to hers. She was early 20s, enthusiastic about everything, and had the kind of optimism that Evelyn both envied and found exhausting. It's just a book, Evelyn said, but she was already reading the first chapter, drawn into de Botton's exploration of how beauty affects the human psyche. A book about happiness and architecture left anonymously on the desk of a UX designer who works for a tech company, housed in the most beautiful building in Denver. Jenna grinned. Honey, that's not random. That's research. Research. The word stuck with Evelyn as she worked through her morning tasks, designing user interfaces that would guide millions of people through digital experiences. Was that what this was? Was Elliot studying her like she was a user experience he wanted to optimize? The thought should have annoyed her. Instead, she found herself intrigued by the sophistication of it. Most men who had shown interest in her over the years had been direct to the point of clumsiness. Dinner invitations, compliments about her appearance, the standard playbook of romantic pursuit. But Elliot was playing an entirely different game. He was courting her mind. At lunch, she walked to the small park across from the building, the same one she could see from her home office window. She'd brought the book with her, and as she sat on a bench eating a salad she'd picked up from the cafe, she found herself highlighting passages almost without thinking. We need beautiful places because beauty calms our inner chaos and encourages our better selves to emerge. What we call a beautiful view might be nothing more than a landscape that enables us to feel we have come home to ourselves. The words resonated with something deep in her chest, a recognition of truths she'd never been able to articulate. Her apartment, her carefully curated spaces, her need for environments that felt safe and controlled. It was all about creating beauty that could hold her anxiety, contain it, transform it into something manageable. I wondered if you'd read it here. His voice came from behind her, and she turned to find Elliot standing a respectful distance away, hands in his pockets, expression uncertain in a way she was beginning to recognize as uniquely hers to witness. "May I?" He gestured to the other end of the bench. She nodded, sliding her bookmark into the pages as he sat down. He was careful to maintain space between them, but she could feel the warmth of his presence like a gentle heat source. "Why this book?" she asked. "Because you design experiences that help people navigate complex systems and find what they're looking for," he said, watching a group of office workers hurry past with their lunch orders. "And because I think you understand something about the relationship between external beauty and internal peace that most people miss." She studied his profile, the strong line of his jaw, the way his dark hair caught the afternoon light, the expensive watch that probably cost more than her annual therapy budget. Everything about him should have screamed privilege and disconnection from the kind of life she lived. But there was something in the way he sat, slightly forward, shoulders carrying tension she recognized, that told a different story. "You read a lot about architecture and happiness?" she asked. "I read a lot about everything. It's a hazard of insomnia and access to unlimited books." He turned to look at her. "What I don't often do is recommend books to people, or leave them on desks, or spend 20 minutes debating whether the gesture would be seen as thoughtful or invasive." The honesty of it made her smile despite herself. "Invasive would have been leaving a note with your name on it. I considered that, decided it was too presumptuous." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the city move around them. Evelyn realized this was the longest conversation they'd had, and the first time it felt less like a negotiation and more like two people simply existing in the same space. "Mr. Thorne, Elliot." Elliot. The name felt strange in her mouth, too intimate for what they were, too formal for what they might be becoming. "Can I ask you something?" "Always." "Why aren't you afraid of me reporting you?" He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. When he did, his voice was softer than she'd ever heard it. "Because fear is the only emotion I've felt consistently for the past 20 years. Fear of failure, fear of betrayal, fear of letting people see who I really am beneath all this." He gestured vaguely at himself, his suit, the building behind them. "And you make me feel curious instead of afraid. That's unprecedented." Something shifted in her chest. Not the flutter of anxiety she knew so well, but something warmer, more dangerous. Like the first crack in ice before it becomes water. Sometimes the most important conversations happen when you're not trying to have them. The panic attack hit Evelyn at 2:47 p.m. on a Wednesday, triggered by nothing more dramatic than an email requesting a rush job on a user interface redesign. The deadline was tight, the client expectations were unclear, and suddenly she was 29 again, sitting in a bank manager's office being told that her numbers weren't good enough, that she needed to push harder, sell more, smile wider. Her chest tightened, her breathing became shallow, and the familiar grip of anxiety wrapped around her throat like an invisible hand. She excused herself from her desk, walking quickly toward the restroom while focusing on the breathing techniques her therapist had taught her. 4 counts in, hold for 4, 4 counts out. The building's restroom was thankfully empty, and she leaned against the cool marble sink staring at her reflection in the mirror. Her face was pale, her gray-blue eyes wide with the kind of fear that had nothing to do with present circumstances, and everything to do with memories that lived in her nervous system. She stayed there for 20 minutes, working through the techniques that had helped her survive the transition from banking to design, from constant performance anxiety to something resembling peace. When she finally felt steady enough to return to her desk, she found a bottle of sparkling water waiting for her, the expensive kind from the executive floor, not the regular stuff from the kitchen. No note, no explanation, just hydration and the quiet message that someone had noticed her absence and cared enough to respond. "Evelyn?" Dax appeared at her cubicle entrance, concern written across his features. "You okay? You looked a little—" "I'm fine," she said automatically, then paused. "Actually, no, I had a panic attack, but I'm managing it." The honesty surprised them both. Evelyn had spent years perfecting the art of appearing fine, of managing her mental health so quietly that no one around her ever had to be uncomfortable with it. "That sucks," Dax said simply. "Want to talk about it?" Before she could answer, her computer chimed with a calendar invitation. Coffee meeting, conference room 22B, 3:30 p.m., optional attendance. The sender was listed as building management, but conference room 22B was on the executive floor, and building management didn't typically schedule coffee meetings with individual contributors. At 3:30, curiosity won over caution. She took the elevator to the 32nd floor, finding conference room 22B empty except for Elliot, 2 cups of coffee, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view of the entire city. "You came," he said, and she heard relief in his voice. "I almost didn't." She accepted the coffee he offered, noting that it was prepared exactly how she liked it. Minimal sugar, no cream. Another small detail that proved he'd been paying attention. "I saw you leave the floor earlier. You were gone for a while." His tone was careful, professional, but his eyes held genuine concern. "I had a panic attack." The words came out before she could stop them. Honest and unfiltered. "It happens sometimes. Usually when work stress triggers memories from my last job." She watched his expression, waiting for the subtle shift that happened when people learned about her mental health struggles. The careful distance, the changed tone, the way conversations became about managing her rather than engaging with her. Instead, Elliot nodded slowly and said, "I have insomnia and persistent anxiety. Started about 15 years ago when the company began to grow beyond my ability to control every variable." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither had expected to cross. "Do you take medication?" she asked. "Tried several. Had bad reactions to most of them." "You?" "Escitalopram. Took me 3 tries to find something that worked without making me feel like a different person." She settled into the chair across from him, realizing this was the first time she'd discussed her mental health with a colleague, much less her CEO, without feeling like she was confessing to a professional weakness. "The panic attacks, are they frequent?" "Less than they used to be. Therapy helps. Having work that doesn't constantly trigger my fight-or-flight response helps more." She met his eyes. "Until recently, this job was the calmest professional environment I'd ever experienced. Until the hybrid work policy." "Until the hybrid work policy," she confirmed. He was quiet for a moment, staring out at the city skyline. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight she hadn't heard before. "I was 7 when my parents died in a car accident. Went to live with my aunt and uncle, who were practical people. They fed me, clothed me, sent me to good schools. But affection wasn't part of the package." He turned back to her. "I learned early that if I was successful enough, accomplished enough, useful enough, people would want to be around me. But I never learned how to tell the difference between people who wanted to be near my success and people who wanted to be near me." The vulnerability of it took her breath away. Here was a man who commanded boardrooms and made decisions that affected thousands of lives, sharing the kind of fundamental loneliness that she recognized in her own chest. "Until the event," she said quietly. "Until you mistook me for someone ordinary enough to hug without ceremony." His smile was soft, almost shy. "For 30 seconds, I was just another person at a party. Not a CEO, not a billionaire, not an opportunity to be leveraged. Just someone you were happy to see." Evelyn felt something crack open in her chest. Not the painful fracture of anxiety, but the gentle opening of understanding. "Is that why you don't like to be touched?" Physical contact usually comes with expectations. Business handshakes, networking embraces, strategic intimacy. He paused. "Your hug was the first touch I'd experienced in years that wanted nothing from me." They sat in silence, drinking coffee and watching the afternoon light shift across the city. Evelyn realized that somewhere in this conversation, they had stopped being CEO and employee and had become simply 2 people who understood something essential about each other. "This is complicated," she said finally. "Very. I don't date people I work for. I don't date people who work for me." Another silence. This one charged with the weight of rules they were both acknowledging and quietly questioning. "But," she said slowly, "I wouldn't be opposed to having coffee with someone who understands that success and happiness aren't the same thing." His smile was the first completely unguarded expression she'd seen from him, and it transformed his entire face into something warm and achingly human. The most dangerous territory isn't where you break the rules. It's where you discover the rules were never really protecting you. Their coffee meetings became a Thursday ritual, always in conference room 22B, always at 3:30, always with the pretense of optional building management discussions that fooled absolutely no one but gave them plausible deniability. For 3 weeks, they talked about books, about the psychology of design, about the weight of expectations, and the luxury of being understood. For 3 weeks, Evelyn felt like she was living in 2 different versions of herself, the professional one who attended meetings and delivered projects on time, and the private one who looked forward to Thursday afternoons with an intensity that scared her. But on the 4th Thursday, everything changed. "I have to tell you something," Elliot said as soon as she entered the conference room. He was standing by the windows instead of sitting at the table, and his usual composed demeanor had been replaced by something that looked almost like panic. "Okay." She set down her coffee, noting that he hadn't prepared his usual cup. Whatever this was, it had disrupted even his careful rituals. "My sister Mira is getting married next weekend. Family wedding, very small, very private. She's been asking me for months if I'm bringing anyone." He turned to face her, and she saw something in his expression she'd never seen before. Vulnerability mixed with determination. "I told her I might be." Evelyn felt her stomach drop and soar simultaneously. "Elliot, I know what this means. I know what I'm asking. A wedding is public, real. It's not coffee meetings disguised as work obligations." He ran a hand through his hair, destroying its usual perfect arrangement. "But I also know that I've spent the last month feeling more like myself than I have in 20 years, and the idea of going back to pretending you don't matter to me is impossible," she finished quietly. "Yes." She walked to the window, standing next to him as they both stared out at the city that had somehow become the backdrop to the most unexpected chapter of her life. "This changes everything. You know that, right?" "I know. If we do this, if we cross this line, there's no going back to casual coffee meetings and professional distance." "I know. The power dynamic alone could destroy both our careers if this goes wrong." "I know." He turned to look at her. "But I also know that I've been half alive for most of my adult life, and these Thursday afternoons with you are the only time I remember what it feels like to be fully present in my own existence." The honesty of it made her chest tight with something that wasn't anxiety. She thought about her therapist's words from their last session. "Sometimes the safest choice isn't actually safe. It's just familiar." "Tell me about the wedding," she said. Relief flooded his features. "It's in Aspen. Small venue, maybe 40 people. Mira's fiancé is a photographer, very laid back, the opposite of corporate. No one there will care about business or networking or," he gestured vaguely, "any of the usual performance. Your sister, what did you tell her about me?" "That I've met someone who makes me want to be better at being human." His smile was soft. She said it was about time. Evelyn found herself laughing despite the weight of the decision she was facing. "She sounds like someone I'd like." "You would. She's the only person who's ever been able to call me on my bullshit and get away with it." "Until now," Evelyn said, and something passed between them that felt like a promise. Until now. They stood in silence, and Evelyn could feel the moment stretching around them like a cocoon. Once she said yes, because she was going to say yes, she could feel it in her bones. Everything would be different. No more careful distance. No more professional pretense. No more hiding behind the safety of uncertainty. "I'll need to take Friday off," she said finally. The smile that spread across his face was worth every risk she was about to take. "I'll have my assistant make the arrangements. We can fly up Friday morning, come back Sunday evening." "We?" "Private jet. One of the few perks of this job that I actually use." He paused. "Unless you'd prefer commercial flights." "I don't want to assume." "Elliot." She turned to face him fully. "If we're doing this, we're doing it honestly. I can't afford private jets. I shop at Target and my car is 7 years old. But I can pack a weekend bag and figure out how to be your date without losing myself in the process. I wouldn't want you to lose yourself. That's the entire point." Something in his voice made her step closer, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, close enough to count the barely visible lines around them that spoke of too many late nights and too much responsibility carried alone. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "When was the last time you touched someone without it being a business handshake or a networking obligation?" The question hung between them like a challenge and an invitation. She watched him consider it, watched him realize what she was really asking. "The night you hugged me," he said quietly. "That's what I thought." She reached out slowly, giving him time to pull away, and placed her hand against his cheek. His skin was warm, Slightly rough from the beard he kept perfectly trimmed, and she felt him lean into the touch like someone who had been holding his breath for years. "We're going to have to figure out how to do this," she said. "The touching, the being close, the learning how to be together when you've spent 20 years being afraid of intimacy. I know. And I'm going to have to figure out how to trust that you want me for the right reasons, not because I'm a puzzle you want to solve, or a challenge you want to win. I know," he said, and then did something that surprised them both. He covered her hand with his own, holding it against his face like an anchor. "But I think we have time to figure it out together. Some moments are so perfect they feel borrowed from someone else's life." The private jet was smaller than Evelyn had imagined, more like an elegant living room with wings than the commercial aircraft she was used to. She sat by the window watching Denver shrink below them, trying not to calculate how much this 40-minute flight probably cost while Elliot worked quietly on his laptop across the aisle. He'd been careful to give her space, sensing her need to process this enormous step at her own pace. But when turbulence hit over the Rockies, his hand found hers without hesitation, steady and warm, and surprisingly calloused for someone who spent most of his time in boardrooms. "You okay?" he asked softly. "I hate flying," she admitted. "Well, I hate not being in control, and flying is just the most obvious example of that. The pilot's been doing this for 15 years. We're safer up here than we are driving on I-25. I know that logically. My anxiety doesn't really care about logic." He squeezed her hand gently. "Tell me about your first panic attack." The question surprised her, but she found herself answering. "I was 26, sitting in a performance review, where my manager told me I needed to smile more and be more approachable, while also hitting numbers that would have been impossible for someone twice my experience level. I went to the bathroom afterward and couldn't breathe for 20 minutes. "What did you do?" "Went back to my desk and pretended it didn't happen. Spent 3 more years pretending it didn't happen, actually." She looked at their joined hands. "What about you? First anxiety attack?" 8 years old. 3 months after my parents died, I was staying with my aunt and uncle, and I overheard them talking about how expensive I was, how they couldn't afford another mouth to feed long term." His thumb traced across her knuckles. "I became convinced that if I wasn't perfect, if I wasn't worth the investment, they'd send me away too." The raw honesty of it made her chest ache. "Is that why you work so hard? Why you've built all this?" "Probably. Hard to untangle survival mechanisms from personality when you've been using them for 30 years. The plane began its descent into Aspen, and Evelyn watched the mountains rise around them like ancient guardians. The resort town spread below looked like something from a postcard. Snow-capped peaks, pristine forests, the kind of natural beauty that made everything else feel small and manageable. "Elliot," she said as they prepared to land, "what did you tell your sister about me? Really?" He was quiet for a moment, then said, "I told her you were the first person in 20 years who made me forget I was performing." The wedding venue was a small mountain lodge overlooking a valley that seemed to stretch into infinity. As they walked up the stone pathway, Evelyn felt overdressed in her navy blue dress and low heels, but Elliot's hand on the small of her back gave her courage. "Ready to meet the family?" he asked. Before she could answer, a woman who looked like a feminine version of Elliot burst through the front doors and wrapped him in a hug that lifted him off the ground. Mira Thorne was shorter than her brother, with the same dark hair and warm brown eyes, but where he carried himself with careful control, she radiated unfiltered joy. "You must be Evelyn," Mira said, turning to her with a smile that was both welcoming and intensely curious. "I was starting to think Elliot had made you up." "I'm real," Evelyn said, accepting Mira's enthusiastic hug. "Congratulations on your wedding." "Thank you. And thank you for getting my brother out of his corporate cave long enough to remember he's a human being." "Mira," Elliot warned, but he was smiling. "What?" "It's true. You should have seen him before you, Evelyn. All work and no play makes Elliot a very successful but very boring boy." The weekend unfolded like something from a different life. The ceremony was intimate and joyful, held on a deck overlooking the mountains with Mira and her fiancé Derek exchanging vows they'd written themselves. Evelyn found herself crying during the readings, not from sadness, but from witnessing the kind of love that felt absolutely real and unguarded. At the reception, she watched Elliot dance with his sister, saw him laugh at Derek's jokes, witnessed him relaxed and present in a way she'd never seen before. When he asked her to dance, she let him lead her onto the small dance floor despite her usual anxiety about being watched. "You're different here," she said as they swayed to a song she didn't recognize. "Different how?" "Lighter. Less like you're carrying the world on your shoulders." Maybe because for the first time in 20 years I'm not worried about what everyone in the room wants from me. He pulled her closer, and she could smell his cologne mixed with mountain air. Well, almost everyone. What do you think I want from you? I think you want me to be real, which is simultaneously the easiest and hardest thing anyone's ever asked of me. Later, as they sat on the lodge's back porch sharing a bottle of wine under more stars than Avalon had ever seen, Mira joined them with Derek in tow. So, Mira said, settling into the chair across from them, are you going to tell her about the therapy? Or should I? Mira, Elliot said, a warning in his voice. What therapy? Avalon asked. He started seeing a therapist 3 weeks ago, Mira announced proudly. First time in his life. Says he's finally ready to work on his intimacy issues and fear of genuine connection. She made air quotes around the phrases. Avalon turned to look at Elliot, who had the grace to look embarrassed. You didn't tell me. I wanted to make sure I was actually going to follow through before I made it part of our conversation. Our conversation? The ongoing negotiation of how two people with anxiety and trust issues figure out how to be together without destroying each other. Derek laughed. That's the most romantic thing I've ever heard. It is, isn't it? Avalon said, surprised by how much she meant it. As the night grew colder and the other guests drifted inside, Avalon and Elliot remained on the porch, wrapped in a blanket someone had left behind, talking about everything and nothing, while the mountains kept their secrets around them. This feels too good to be real, she said, her head resting against his shoulder. I know. I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop. What if it doesn't? What if this is just what it looks like when two people stop being afraid of wanting something? He turned to kiss the top of her head, and for the first time in either of their lives, the future felt like something worth hoping for, instead of something to survive. The hardest part about perfect weekends is that they end on Monday morning. The text message arrived at 7:43 a.m., just as Avalon was settling into her workstation with coffee and the lingering warmth of the most beautiful weekend of her adult life. It was from Jenna, the junior designer, and it contained only a link to a gossip blog called Corporate Tea Spill. Tech Billionaire's Mountain Romance. Thorne and Zeiss CEO spotted with mystery employee at private wedding. Below the headline were photos, grainy but unmistakable shots of her and Elliot dancing at the reception, walking hand in hand on the lodge's deck, sharing wine under the stars. Someone had been there with a long-range camera, turning their most intimate moments into content for strangers to consume and judge. Avalon's hands trembled as she scrolled through the article, each paragraph worse than the last. Sources close to the company report that the mystery woman is a mid-level designer who gained viral fame months ago for an awkward encounter with Thorne at a company event. Industry insiders question whether the recently implemented hybrid work policy was designed to facilitate this relationship. Employment lawyers suggest this could represent a significant conflict of interest. The comments section was brutal. Speculation about her motivations, her appearance, her worthiness. Screenshots from the original viral video. Side-by-side comparisons with women Elliot had been photographed with at charity events. The narrative was already crystallizing. Ambitious employee seduces naive CEO. Classic gold digger story. Hey, you okay? Dax appeared at her cubicle, concern written across his face. You look like you've seen a ghost. Before she could answer, her phone buzzed with a call from HR requesting an immediate meeting. Then another text, this one from a number she didn't recognize. Interested in telling your side of the story? TMZ pays well for exclusive interviews. The HR meeting was a masterclass in professional humiliation, disguised as policy clarification. Jennifer Walsh, the VP of Human Resources, sat across from Avalon in a sterile conference room with a folder of printed screenshots and a tone that suggested she was already calculating severance packages. These photos have created what we might call an optics problem, Jennifer said, sliding the printouts across the table. The board is concerned about potential legal liabilities, workplace equity issues, the appearance of favoritism. Nothing inappropriate happened, Avalon said, grateful that her voice remained steady. We attended a family wedding together. As far as I know, there's no company policy against employees socializing outside of work. There's no policy against mid-level employees socializing with each other, Jennifer corrected. There are very different considerations when one of those employees is the CEO and majority shareholder. The meeting lasted 45 minutes and ended with Avalon being placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Corporate speak for being suspended while they figured out how to minimize damage to the company's reputation. She cleaned out her desk in a daze, aware of colleagues watching from their peripheral vision, conversations pausing as she passed. The same office that had begun to feel like home now felt like a crime scene where she was both victim and perpetrator. Her phone had been buzzing constantly, reporters, bloggers, even a producer from a podcast about workplace scandals. She turned it off, grabbed her things, and left the building without looking back. She was halfway home when she realized Elliot would be walking into this storm completely unprepared. The penthouse elevator required a special keycard, but the security guard recognized her from the photos and waved her up with a smirk that made her skin crawl. She found Elliot in his home office, still in his suit from whatever crisis meeting he'd been pulled into, staring at multiple computer screens displaying news articles, stock reports, and what looked like legal documents. "How bad is it?" she asked from the doorway. He turned and she saw exhaustion in his eyes mixed with something that might have been relief. "Bad. The board called an emergency meeting. Legal is recommending we issue a statement distancing the company from any personal relationships between employees. Stock dropped 3% in the first hour of trading. And us? They want me to end it. Publicly, if necessary." The words hit her like cold water, not because they were surprising, but because they made everything that had felt magical and possible suddenly seem naive and temporary. "Maybe they're right," she said quietly. "Maybe this was always going to be impossible." "Is that what you think?" She walked to his windows, looking out at the city where she'd built a careful, quiet life that was now splashed across gossip blogs and corporate scandal sheets. "I think I'm not built for this level of scrutiny. I think I've spent my entire adult life trying to be invisible, and this—" She gestured vaguely at the computers, the headlines, the mess they'd created. "This is the opposite of everything I need to stay healthy. So we run away? We let them win? We protect ourselves? We go back to being CEO and employee? You find someone who can handle being a public figure, and I go back to being nobody special." The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of everything they were considering giving up. "There's something else," Elliot said finally. "I've been offered a position with a startup in Seattle. Complete change of scene, smaller company, chance to build something new without all the baggage of this place. You're leaving? I'm considering it. The question is whether I'm leaving alone or with someone who's willing to figure out how to build a life that doesn't require us to hide who we are." Evelyn felt her heart break and soar simultaneously. He was offering her an escape, a new start, a chance to be together without the complications of their current situation. But he was also asking her to uproot the life she'd carefully constructed, to trust that what they had was strong enough to survive another major change. "That's a lot to ask," she said. "I know. I'd have to leave my therapist, my apartment, the job I love. I know. And we'd be starting over in a new city where we don't know anyone, trying to build something real while you're launching a company, and I'm looking for work. I know." He stood up, walking to stand next to her at the window. "But I also know that the last month with you has been the most honest I've ever been in my life. And if we walk away from this because it's complicated, I think we'll both spend the rest of our lives wondering what we could have built together." Outside, the sun was setting over Denver, painting the sky in shades of possibility and farewell, while inside, two people stood at the edge of the biggest decision of their lives. The bravest thing you can do is choose love when fear would be so much easier. Evelyn spent 3 days in her apartment, existing on chamomile tea and delivery food while her phone remained turned off, and the outside world continued its commentary on her private life. She'd been suspended pending investigation, which meant she had nothing but time to think about Elliot's offer and everything it would mean to accept it. On Wednesday evening, her doorbell rang. She almost didn't answer it. Reporters had been camping outside her building since Monday, and she'd learned to ignore the constant buzzing. But something made her check the peephole, and she found herself looking at a woman who could only be Elliot's sister. "Mira?" she said, opening the door cautiously. "In the flesh. Can I come in? I brought wine and unsolicited advice." Mira swept into the apartment with the same confident energy she'd displayed at the wedding, carrying a bottle of expensive-looking wine and a canvas bag that smelled like fresh bread. "How did you know where I live?" "Elliot's been pacing his penthouse like a caged animal for 3 days, muttering your address and looking like someone kicked his puppy." Mira settled onto Evelyn's couch like she belonged there. "I figured one of us should actually talk to you instead of just brooding dramatically." Despite everything, Evelyn found herself smiling. "How is he?" "Terrible. Wonderful. Completely lost and absolutely certain at the same time." Mira opened the wine with practiced efficiency. He's in love with you, you know. Real, honest to God, willing to burn down his empire love. He told you that? He didn't have to. I've never seen him fight for anything personal in his entire life. Work, success, money, sure. But never for something that was just for him. Mira handed her a glass of wine. The Seattle thing is real, by the way. The offer came in yesterday, and it's exactly what he needs. Smaller company, innovative work, chance to build something without all the baggage he's carrying here. What about you? His family, his life here? Honey, Derek and I are moving to Portland next month anyway. Elliot's life here consists of work, insomnia, and ordering groceries online. He doesn't have a life here. He has a routine. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, drinking wine while the reality of the situation settled around them. Can I ask you something? Mira said. What are you afraid of? The question hit deeper than Evelyn expected. Everything. Failing, succeeding, being seen, being forgotten. Making the wrong choice and regretting it forever. Making the right choice and not being strong enough to handle it. That's a lot of fear. I've been anxious my whole life. It's easier to be afraid than to be disappointed. But you were willing to go to that wedding with him. You were willing to risk everything for one weekend. That was different. That felt possible, manageable. This feels like jumping off a cliff with no idea what's at the bottom. Mira leaned forward, and Evelyn saw the same intensity in her eyes that she recognized in Elliot. Can I tell you something about my brother? He spent 30 years making safe choices, building walls, protecting himself from exactly this kind of risk. And he's been miserable, successful, respected, financially secure, and absolutely miserable. And you think I can change that? I think you already have. The question is whether you're brave enough to let him change you too. After Mira left, Evelyn sat alone in her apartment with the wine and her thoughts, finally allowing herself to imagine what Seattle might look like. A new city, a fresh start, the chance to build something with Elliot that wasn't overshadowed by corporate policies and gossip blogs, but also leaving her therapist, her carefully constructed support system, the job she'd grown to love, starting over in her 30s with a man she'd known for barely 2 months, in a relationship that would always carry the weight of how it began. At 11 p.m., she turned her phone back on. 47 missed calls, hundreds of text messages, and one voicemail from Elliot sent just an hour earlier. I know you need space to think, and I'm trying to respect that. But I need you to know that whatever you decide, I'm proud of you for considering it. You've already changed my life just by being in it. The Seattle offer is real and it's good, but it's only interesting to me if you're part of it. I love you, Evelyn. I know it's too soon to say that. I know it complicates everything. But I love who you are and who I am when I'm with you. Call me when you're ready. She listened to the message 3 times, then called him back. Evelyn? His voice was rough with sleep and worry. I have conditions, she said without preamble. Okay. I want to find my own job in Seattle. I don't want to work for you or any company you're involved with. I need to know I can take care of myself. Done. I want us to do couples therapy from the beginning. Not crisis counseling when things go wrong, but proactive work on communication and trust, and all the ways 2 anxious people can hurt each other without meaning to. I already found 3 therapists in Seattle who specialize in exactly that. And I want you to promise me that if this doesn't work out, if we try and fail, you won't make it weird or vindictive or corporate. That we can be adults about ending things if we need to. I promise. Is that a yes? Evelyn looked around her apartment, at the books on her shelves, the plants on her windowsill, the life she'd built that was safe and predictable and small. Then she thought about dancing with Elliot under the stars, about the way he'd looked at her when she touched his face, about the possibility of building something bigger than either of them could create alone. It's a yes, she said, and felt her entire future rearrange itself around those 3 words. 6 weeks later, she stood in the lobby of Innovate Labs in downtown Seattle, wearing a new suit for her first day as their senior UX director. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, she could see Elliot's building 3 blocks away, where he was building the kind of company he'd always dreamed of. Smaller, more personal, focused on innovation rather than empire. They'd found an apartment in Capitol Hill with exposed brick walls and enough space for both of them to work from home when they needed to. They had dinner reservations that night at a small restaurant Mira had recommended, and therapy on Thursday mornings, and plans to visit Denver for the holidays. It wasn't perfect. They still had bad days, still struggled with anxiety and trust, and the weight of their respective histories. But it was real, and it was theirs. and it was built on the foundation of two people who had decided that love was worth the risk of being seen. As she walked into her new life, Evelyn realized that sometimes the biggest mistake you can make is playing it safe, and sometimes the best decisions start with accidentally hugging the wrong person. The life we choose. 2 years later, the keynote speech was scheduled for 2 p.m. at the Denver Convention Center, and Evelyn found herself in the strangest position of her adult life, sitting in the front row, watching the man she loved prepare to tell their story to 3,000 strangers. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Elliot Thorne, CEO and founder of Innovate Labs. The applause was thunderous as Elliot walked onto the stage, and Evelyn felt that familiar flutter of pride mixed with amazement that this brilliant, complex man had chosen to build a life with her. He looked confident up there, comfortable in a way he never had during his corporate days, wearing his signature dark suit but with an ease that spoke of someone who had finally learned to be himself. 2 years ago, he began, his voice carrying clearly through the auditorium. I was the CEO of a successful tech company, worth more money than I knew what to do with and absolutely miserable. I had everything I thought I wanted and nothing I actually needed. Evelyn smiled, remembering their therapy sessions where he'd worked through exactly this realization, how success without connection was just elaborate loneliness. I want to talk to you today about failure, Elliot continued. Not the kind of failure that makes headlines or crashes stock prices, but the quiet failure of living a life that looks perfect from the outside, while feeling empty on the inside. In the audience, phones were already out, people capturing sound bites for LinkedIn posts and conference recaps. But Evelyn noticed something different about this crowd's attention. They weren't just listening for networking opportunities or business insights. They were listening like people who recognized themselves in his words. The turning point for me came through what I can only describe as a case of mistaken identity. Someone confused me for an ordinary person, treated me like I was worth knowing for reasons that had nothing to do with my bank account or my business card, and that 30-second interaction changed the entire trajectory of my life. He paused, scanning the audience until his eyes found hers. The smile he gave her was soft, private, the kind of look that made the rest of the world disappear. I won't tell you that love conquers all, because that's not true. What I will tell you is that authentic connection, the kind where someone sees you clearly and chooses you anyway, gives you the courage to build a life worth living instead of just a life worth envying. Evelyn thought about their apartment in Seattle, with its mismatched furniture and walls covered in both their books, about the small garden they'd planted on the roof, where they had coffee every morning and talked through their respective anxieties about the day ahead, about the couple's therapy sessions that had taught them how to fight fairly and love generously, about the quiet Sunday mornings when they worked side by side at their dining room table, building their separate careers while building their shared life. The company I run now is smaller than the one I left behind. We have 60 employees instead of 3,000, and our valuation is a fraction of what Thorne & Zeiss was worth when I walked away. But we're building something that matters, with people who are here because they want to be, and I go home every night to someone who knows exactly who I am when I take off the CEO mask. The speech continued for 20 more minutes, covering innovation and authenticity in business, the importance of psychological safety in the workplace, and the radical idea that perhaps the most successful life wasn't the one that looked the most impressive, but the one that felt the most true. But Evelyn found herself thinking about the anonymous blog she'd been writing for the past 18 months, Recovering Perfectionist, where she shared stories about anxiety, career transitions, and learning to build a life that fit who you actually were, instead of who you thought you should be. The blog had found an audience of people who, like her, were tired of performing success and ready to pursue fulfillment. Last month, a publisher had reached out about turning it into a book. Next month, she was starting a consulting practice helping companies design better user experiences for employees dealing with mental health challenges. None of it was what she'd planned 2 years ago, but all of it felt like the life she was meant to be living. After the speech, as they walked through downtown Denver toward the restaurant where they'd had their first real conversation, Evelyn reached for Elliot's hand. "How does it feel to be back?" she asked. "Strange. Good strange." He squeezed her fingers. "I keep expecting to feel nostalgic or regretful, but mostly I just feel grateful that we had the courage to leave." They passed the Thorne & Zeiss building, gleaming in the afternoon sun, still impressive and imposing, and completely foreign to who they'd become. In the lobby, Evelyn could see people in expensive suits having intense conversations, chasing deadlines and metrics, and the kind of success that had once consumed both their lives. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked. "The money, the power, the certainty of knowing exactly what was expected of you?" "Never." "Do you miss hiding?" She considered the question as they walked, thinking about the woman who had spent 4 years working remotely to avoid the complexity of office relationships, who had panic attacks in bank bathrooms and dressed like she was auditioning for a life she wasn't sure she wanted. "No," she said finally. "I miss the simplicity sometimes, but I don't miss the hiding." That evening they sat on the roof garden of their Seattle apartment, sharing takeout from their favorite Thai restaurant, while the city sparkled below them. Elliot was reading a book about sustainable business practices, and Evelyn was editing a chapter about workplace anxiety for her upcoming publication. "Random question," she said, looking up from her laptop. "If you could go back and tell your 38-year-old self one thing, what would it be?" "That the scariest decisions usually lead to the best outcomes." He closed his book and looked at her. "What about you?" "That being seen is worth the risk of being judged." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the Pacific Northwest, while planes traced lines across the sky. Other people going to other places, making their own choices about what kind of life they wanted to build. "Elliot? Thank you for changing company policy to see me again." His laugh was warm and unguarded, the sound of someone who had learned to find joy in the everyday moments of loving and being loved. "Thank you for mistaking me for someone worth hugging." In the distance, Seattle hummed with the energy of possibility, while on a rooftop garden, two people who had once been afraid of their own hearts sat planning a future built on the radical idea that the right person was worth any risk, any change, any leap of faith required to choose love over fear. What would you have done in Evelyn's situation? Would you have had the courage to risk everything for the possibility of real love? And if someone saw your truest self, anxiety, imperfections and all, and chose you anyway, would you be brave enough to let them? What did this story teach you about the difference between being successful and being truly happy? Your participation in our channel is very important. Please leave your opinion in the comments.